February 17, 1985, 11:42 p.m., Irvine, California. A quiet suburban street where the air smells like jasmine and salt, the kind of neighborhood where people move to disappear into the mundane rhythm of lawnmowers and school runs. Silence. Detective Bob Palumbo stands at the door of a modest bungalow, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His finger is trembling on the trigger of his service weapon. He's spent a decade chasing a shadow, a ghost that left a trail of blood from Medellin to Miami. He expects a bloodbath. He expects to find a fortress guarded by men with submachine guns and hearts of stone. He expects the Queen to go down swinging, surrounded by mountains of contraband and the frantic energy of a cornered predator. He kicks the door open. The wood splinters, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the midnight stillness. But there is no return fire, no shouting, no frantic scurrying of soldiers. Inside, the house is bathed in a soft amber glow. There, sitting on the edge of a neatly made bed, is a woman. She isn't wearing a crown of bullets or a designer suit. She's wearing a simple robe, her face aged by the gravity of her own history. She is calmly reading a Bible. She looks up. Her eyes aren't filled with fear or rage. They are ancient, dark pools of absolute certainty. She locks eyes with Palumbo, the man who has sacrificed his sleep, his sanity, and his youth to find her, and she doesn't scream. She doesn't reach for a weapon. She leans forward, her voice a dry rasp, and whispers a name. It isn't Bob. It isn't Detective. It's his daughter's middle name, a name that wasn't in any public file, a name spoken only in the privacy of his own home. In that heartbeat, Palumbo realized the terrifying truth. He hadn't caught a criminal. He had invited a ghost into his life. This is the story of the night the world's most dangerous woman was finally put in handcuffs, and why the man who caught her spent the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. To understand how a seasoned DEA detective ends up paralyzed by a whisper, you have to understand the chessboard as it stood in the mid-1980s. By then, Griselda Blanco was no longer just a drug trafficker. She was a myth wrapped in a thick shroud of paranoia. The streets called her the Godmother, or the Black Widow, and the names weren't just hyperbole. She had pioneered the very methods of narco-terrorism that would later become the signatures of the cartels. She didn't just kill her enemies, she erased them, along with their families, their memories, and anyone who had ever shaken their hand. But the Miami of the late 70s, the sun-drenched, blood-soaked playground where she rose to power, had become too hot even for her. The DEA and the Miami Police Department had formed a dragnet that spanned continents. They were no longer just looking for shipments, they were looking for a monster. And so the Madrinha evolved. She didn't retreat into the jungles of Colombia, where she would be just another target for a rival's bullet. She did something far more sophisticated. She hid in plain sight. In the quiet suburbs of California, she transformed herself into a middle-aged mother. She lived in a house that looked like every other house on the block. She drove a car that wouldn't merit a second glance. To her neighbors, she was a quiet woman who kept to herself, perhaps a grandmother enjoying a peaceful retirement. But beneath that veneer of suburban boredom, she was still managing a shadow empire. She didn't need a boardroom or a radio tower. She ran the world through payphones and coded messages delivered by couriers who looked like grocery delivery boys. Detective Bob Palumbo was the man assigned to solve the puzzle. He was the quintessential hunter, methodical, relentless, and deeply principled. To Palumbo, Griselda was the ultimate trophy, the one arrest that would justify every missed birthday and every late night at the precinct. He treated the case like a holy mission. He mapped her life, her habits, and her psyche. He knew her better than he knew his own brothers, or so he thought. The system was closing in, but the rules of engagement had changed. In the early days, it was about who had the most guns. Now, it was about who controlled the narrative of fear. To the police, she was a case file that needed to be closed. To the streets, she was a deity. To Palumbo, she was becoming an obsession that threatened to dismantle his entire reality. He believed that once the handcuffs clicked, the power would shift. He believed the law was a shield. He didn't realize that for a woman like Griselda, a prison cell is just another room from which to issue orders. The fracture in Palumbo's world didn't start with a shootout. It started in a dimly lit office in a federal building, with the mundane sound of a filing cabinet drawer sliding open. There was a low-level administrative clerk, a man whose name history has largely forgotten, but whose actions would haunt Palombo for decades. This clerk was drowning in gambling debt, the kind of debt that turns a decent man into a desperate one. He didn't sell secrets about undercover agents or GPS coordinates of drug labs. He thought he was playing it safe. He sold a non-sensitive file to an anonymous buyer for a few $1,000s. It was a folder containing Palombo's personal information, not his case notes, but his life, utility bills, home address, the names of his children, the schools they attended, the grocery store where his wife June bought their milk. The clerk told himself it was a victimless crime. He wasn't a traitor, he was just a guy paying off a bookie. He had no idea that he had just handed the keys to Palombo's sanctuary directly to the godmother. While Palombo was busy building a legal cage for Griselda, she was building a psychological one for him. She didn't want him dead, not yet. A dead detective is a martyr, a catalyst for more heat. No, she wanted something much more cruel. She wanted him to know that the walls he built around his family were made of glass. This brings us to the token. A small, hand-carved wooden figurine of St. Lazarus. In the syncretic traditions that Griselda followed, Lazarus is a powerful figure, the patron of the poor, the sick, and those who have returned from the brink. To her, it was a symbol of protection and resurrection. To anyone else, it was just a piece of folk art. But when these figurines began to appear in Palombo's private life, their meaning shifted into something predatory. The first one appeared on his dashboard. He had left his car locked in the secure parking lot of the federal building. When he returned after a grueling 14-hour shift, there it was, sitting right above the steering wheel. A small wooden man on crutches staring at him with painted eyes. There was no sign of a break-in, no scratched paint, no shattered glass, just the silent wooden witness. Palombo felt a chill that the California sun couldn't warm. He told himself it was a prank, a colleague playing a dark joke, but deep down, the hunter's instinct told him otherwise. The arrest was only days away. He was closing the net, but the prey was already inside his skin. The night of the arrest, February 17th, should have been the pinnacle of his career. It was the result of thousands of man-hours and millions of dollars. But as he stood in that bedroom in Irvine, watching Griselda read her Bible, the victory tasted like ash. Her calm wasn't the calm of a woman who had lost. It was the calm of a woman who had already moved her pieces into position. When she whispered his daughter's name, Palombo felt the world tilt. He realized that the perimeter he thought he was guarding had been breached months ago. As he led her out in handcuffs, the neighborhood was still silent. No neighbors came to their windows. No dogs barked. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen now that the monster was finally in the light. But as the police cars pulled away, a figure stood in the shadows of a nearby garden. A man the neighborhood knew only as the gardener, a quiet worker who had been trimming hedges and planting marigolds for weeks. He didn't look like a hitman. He didn't look like a criminal. He just watched the taillights disappear, his hand resting on a small wooden figurine in his pocket. The arrest was over. The nightmare was just beginning. Palombo had the body of the godmother, but he was starting to realize that her reach didn't stop at the prison gates. In fact, now that she was in the system, she had a front-row seat to his life. And as the iron doors of the detention center slammed shut, Palombo found himself wondering if he was the one who had been locked in. 24 hours after the arrest, that should have been the crowning achievement of his career, Detective Bob Palombo walked into the secure parking garage of the federal building. The air was heavy with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his keys. He felt a brief sense of accomplishment. Griselda Blanco, the woman who had turned Miami into a war zone, was finally behind bars. The godmother was in a cage. The world was safer. He unlocked his car, the electronic chirp echoing through the empty garage. He sat in the driver's seat, exhaling a long, weary breath. Then he looked up at the dashboard. There it was, the small hand-carved wooden figurine of St. Lazarus, the same one he had seen in the evidence photos from her hideouts. the same one that represented protection in her dark, ritualistic world. It was sitting exactly where it had been days before the arrest. But this time it was different. This time there was a small handwritten note tucked under the base of the wood. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a demand. It was a date. The date of his daughter's next school play. The silence in that garage became deafening. Palombo's hands began to shake, not with the adrenaline of the hunt, but with the cold, hollow realization that the cage he had put her in had no walls. He realized that while he was gathering evidence against her, she had been gathering a map of his soul. To understand the sheer weight of this psychological siege, you have to look at how Griselda Blanco operated. Most criminals hide from the law. Griselda studied it. She didn't just want to evade capture. She wanted to colonize the minds of those who dared to pursue her. Even from a high-security holding cell, she was orchestrating a symphony of intimidation. During a private interrogation session 3 days later, Palombo tried to regain control. He sat across from her in a small, windowless room. The air was stale, smelling of floor wax and burnt coffee. He laid out the evidence, the ledgers, the recorded phone calls, the testimony of high-level informants like Max Mermelstein. Mermelstein was a man who knew where the bodies were buried, literally. He was the crown jewel of the prosecution's case, yet even he was a man living on the edge of a nervous breakdown. He had told Palombo, "You don't understand. Her reach isn't a distance. It's an inevitability." Palombo pushed a photo of a cocaine shipment toward her. Griselda didn't even look at it. She leaned back, her eyes fixed on his. She began to speak, her voice low and rhythmic, like a grandmother telling a bedtime story. But she wasn't talking about drug routes. She began describing the exact layout of Palombo's backyard. She mentioned the swing set that needed a new coat of paint. She mentioned the specific way the jasmine bushes near the porch smelled after a heavy rain. She even mentioned the loose floorboard on the back deck that creaked when his wife June stepped on it. Palombo felt the oxygen leave the room. He hadn't just been watched. He had been studied like an insect under a microscope. He realized then that the gardener he had seen in his neighborhood wasn't just a random worker. He was a silent operative, a human camera who had spent weeks documenting the rhythms of Palombo's sanctuary. The non-sensitive file sold by the precinct clerk hadn't just provided an address. It had provided a blueprint for a haunting. The psychological pressure reached its zenith 48 hours before the trial began. Palombo arrived home to find his wife, June, standing in the foyer, her face pale. On the dining room table sat a package. It was wrapped in vintage paper, tied with a simple silk ribbon. There was no return address. Inside was a vintage porcelain doll, exquisite and rare. It was exactly the kind of doll his daughter had mentioned wanting months ago in the privacy of their living room. There was no bomb. There was no poison. There was only the message, "I am in your house. I am with your children. I am the air you breathe." This was the Madrinha's true power. She didn't need to pull a trigger to kill a man's peace of mind. She just needed to show him that his victory was an illusion. Palombo was the one with the badge, the gun, and the authority of the United States government. But as he looked at that doll, he felt like a trespasser in his own life. The trial in Miami was a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with international press, stone-faced associates of the Medellin cartel, and curious onlookers who wanted to see the face of the woman who had redefined crime in America. The atmosphere was thick, with a strange, funeral-like tension. Everyone expected Griselda to cause a scene. They expected her to scream at the judge, to deny the charges with the fiery arrogance that had defined her rise. Instead, she was a statue of regal silence. She sat at the defense table, draped in a conservative suit, her hair perfectly coiffed. She never once looked at the judge. She never looked at the jury. Her eyes were fixed squarely on Bob Palombo, who sat at the prosecution table, trying to maintain the professional facade of a lead detective. When the lead prosecutor rose to present the primary evidence, the smoking gun that would put her away for decades, the room held its breath. It was the moment of total legal triumph. But as the prosecutor spoke, Griselda slowly reached into the pocket of her blazer. The movement was so deliberate, so calm, that the bailiffs froze, their hands hovering over their holsters. She didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a small, wooden St. Lazarus figurine. She placed it gently on the table in front of her, facing Palombo. The room went cold. To the judge and the jury, it was a strange, perhaps religious gesture. But to Palombo, it was a declaration of war. It was her way of saying that while the law might own her body, she owned the deed to his house. She was telling him that the trial wasn't about her guilt, it was about his safety. The conviction was inevitable, but so was the cost. The prosecution won. The evidence was overwhelming, and the godmother was sentenced to a long stretch in federal prison. On paper, it was the greatest win in the history of the DEA's fight against the South American cartels. The headlines blared about the end of an era. Politicians took credit. The precinct celebrated. But for Detective Bob Palombo, there was no celebration. In the 72 hours following the verdict, Palombo didn't go to a victory party. He didn't accept the handshakes of his superiors. He went home, packed his family's lives into a few suitcases, and moved them to an undisclosed location. He became a fugitive of his own success. He realized that as long as Griselda Blanco was alive, and even after she was gone, the shadow she cast would never leave his doorstep. 6 months later, at the height of his career, Bob Palombo retired from the force. He couldn't trust a single face in a crowd. He couldn't walk past a jasmine bush without smelling the interrogation room. He couldn't look at his daughter without wondering if the person standing behind her in a grocery line was one of Griselda's gardeners. The city eventually moved on to new villains and new heroes, but the legend of the Madrinha remained, etched in the psychological scars of the man who caught her. Griselda Blanco proved that the most effective weapon in the world isn't a bullet. It's the absolute certainty that you are being watched. She turned a federal prison cell into a throne room, proving that true power doesn't come from being free. It comes from making your enemies feel like they are the ones in chains. In the shadow of the godmother, the loudest threat is a gunshot. But the one that freezes your life forever is the silence that follows. Palombo had won the case, but he had lost his peace of mind, a trade that haunted him until the day he died. Looking back at the cold calculation of the Madrinha, it forces us to ask a question that most of us would rather avoid. If catching the ultimate criminal meant looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life, if it meant knowing that your family would never truly be safe again, would you still make the arrest? Or would you let the monster stay in the dark just to keep the lights on in your own home? If you want to dive deeper into the hidden strategies and psychological games of history's most complex figures, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. There are many more stories where the real battle isn't fought with weapons, but with the mind. If this story of the godmother's final move stayed with you, give us a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you have traded your peace for justice? We'll see you in the next story.